here comes the official one. Welcome and good evening. It's wonderful to see you all. And to have such a wonderful turnout for our event. This evening we're having a lecture from Professor Joan Branham. Professor Branham is with us this year as Acting Director of Women's Studies and Religion Program, and it has indeed been a delight to have her back to Harvard. She was here as a Women's Studies Associate. She teaches at Providence College, but has come up and is joining us for the year and is doing a really remarkable job in steering this program through for the year during the absence of Ann Browdy on leave. She is a visiting associate professor of women's studies in Christianity and Judaism during her visit here. But her normal position is as the associate professor of art history at Providence College, where she teaches courses in late antique and medieval art and architectural history. She also serves as vice president chair of fellowships for the W.F. Albright Institute of Archaeological Research in Jerusalem, an extremely important institute for biblical research, again located in Jerusalem. Joan received her PhD from Emory University in 1993 and conducted her doctoral research at the Institute of Archaeology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She's received a number of postdoctoral awards, some very prestigious places, including a fellowship at the Getty Institute, the Getty Center for the History of Art and Humanities, a Chateaubriand Fellowship at the École Pratique at the Haute École at the Sorbonne in Paris, and of course a WSRP Associate Fellowship here at Harvard Divinity School. And in 2002, a National Endowment for the Humanities Award. Joan's research and interests in publication have focused on theories of sacred space, the relationship of gender, blood, and sacrifice in ancient Judaism and Christianity, and the art and archaeology of the Jerusalem Temple, including late antique synagogues and churches. She has a number of really fascinating articles and publications in this material. I'll just give you a couple of titles to whet your interest. Penetrating the Sacred, Breaches and Barriers in the Jerusalem Temple. Women as Objects of Sacrifice, and Early Christian Chancel of the Virgins, and Vicarious Sacrality, Temple Space in Ancient Synagogues. She's also been a consultant for a number of documentary film projects, including an upcoming Nova special that's going to air on PBS in 2008. So she's not only famous as an art historian, but is herself documented on film individual. In the spring, she's going to teach a course entitled Ritual, Gender, and Space in Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity. Students, I suggest that you check out this course. It's going to be a marvelous addition to our curriculum, and again, a one-time kind of offering. But today, she's going to share with us some of her work in progress, entitled, as you can see, Mapping Sacrifice on Bodies and Spaces in Ancient Judaism and Early Christianity. Welcome, Joan.
I wanted to say I'm so delighted to be here. I was, as Karen mentioned, a research associate in the Women's Studies and Religion program back in 2001, and actually September 11th, 2001 was the first day of the semester. It was a very intense year that year. And I remember it very well, but it was an incredible year for my research, and I was delighted when I got a call last year from Ann Browdy and an invitation from her and the dean, Bill Graham, to come and direct the program this year. So my job this year really is to sort of spotlight and support the other RAs, but as this bonus, I'm so happy to be able to share a little bit of my ongoing research as well, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about tonight, some of the things I'm working on. I also just want to thank you for being here, because I understand from the calendar that there are simultaneously at least 4 to 5 other events you could be at. And if you've been to the graduate student party and had a few drinks, and been to the dean's tea and had a few drinks, and been here and had a few drinks, and if during the presentation things seem to not be so coherent, I assure you it is not you, it is me. It is the presentation. This is really, truly a work in progress, and I found myself sort of lurching all over the page as I was putting some thoughts together. So just have another drink. Okay. I'd like to begin by saying a few words about the subject of my larger research interests. Let me just see if I can actually put my papers together here. And then I'd like to just select two examples or pieces of evidence within that larger umbrella structure to share with you this evening. For some time, I've been interested in theories of sacred space, and more specifically in textual and visual strategies within early Judaism and Christianity to deal with the model of sacrality associated with and attributed to the ancient temple in Jerusalem. I've been particularly interested in reformulating questions within the study of religion from who or what qualifies as or is defined as sacred, profane, gendered, sacrificial. These are questions that I actually used to ask, and I've even seen in my own work I've been reformulating those questions instead to ask how categories such as sacred, profane, gendered, and sacrificial are constructed through both discursive and non-discursive means. That is to say, how do these constructs, or how have these constructs emerged and been reinforced through textual and narrative means on the one hand, and also through material, visual, architectural, and ritual means on the other hand. So as someone trained primarily in art history, I'm especially interested in spatial and iconographical forces at work in ritual, and in examining religious architecture not simply as places that shelter or house religious communities and rituals, but really as powerful agents that amplify, choreograph, negotiate, and engender religious communities and rituals. So today I'd like to propose some questions and provide some theoretical framework for addressing three spatial settings within late antique Judaism and Christianity. The temple in Jerusalem, seen here at night. This is a model. I'll talk about that in a moment. Ancient synagogues and early churches. And likewise, I'd like to think about the relationship among these institutions. I brought two examples today. The first example is textual. And as is well known, one of the mainstays, I would say, of patristic literature is the typological association of the early church to the Jewish temple and tabernacle, rendering the church as the new temple that displaces, eclipses, fulfills the mission of the Jewish forerunner. So mapping Jewish sacrificial space onto ecclesiastical space appears as really a common literary and iconographical trope. But some early Christian texts seem to take a sort of turn and a perplexing twist when certain groups of women, virgins and widows in particular, are figured as sacrificial furniture or props from the Jewish sacrificial stage set. A number of texts refer to women as altars, altars of gold, altars of bronze, incense on the altar. What is going on here? What's operating here? And what is at stake when sacrificial accoutrements from the tabernacle and Jerusalem temple traditions are superimposed onto Christian female bodies? Today, I'd like to examine briefly some of these selected texts from late antiquity that correlate Christian women and Jewish sacrificial paraphernalia. The second example I'd like to look at is from a synagogue mosaic, the 5th century Sepphoris synagogue. And I just want to say that actually when I see so many students here, I'm so pleased to see students. When I was writing my dissertation and had just finished it, this synagogue was discovered. And it took a while for the excavation to take place and the documentation, and I've been waiting for the final excavation report to be published, which has now been published in 2005. And so this is tonight really one of the first times I've addressed this publicly, and I'll be showing some images of this synagogue mosaic. And I've been waiting specifically for it because it has a great deal of relevance to some of these questions that I'm asking. In the synagogue, the 5th century Sepphoris synagogue, a number of sacrificial images of the Jerusalem temple and tabernacle tradition appear in what is very notably a non-sacrificial space, that is to say, the synagogue of late antiquity. What is at stake here when sacrificial maps are superimposed onto non-sacrificial territories? So those are basically the sort of two umbrella questions that I'm going to ask, and I'm going to present some of this evidence, and really I hope just open it up and let us all sort of have at it a bit. I also have entitled this talk, Mapping Sacrifice on Bodies and Spaces, So I'd like to say something about sacrifice for a few minutes, and I'd also like to say something about mapping in a few minutes. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that what would be a better way to talk about sacrifice than to show you a sacrifice. So I've got my knife here. No, just joking. So what I'd like to do, actually, is share with you something Karen mentioned, and that is something that I'm working on right now, which is a 2-hour PBS Nova special. I'm just one of the scholarly consultants. Other people here at Harvard as well, Shia Cohen, Peter Machinas, are people interviewed in this project, but I happen to have an inside take on it because my husband is the producer and director, Gary Glassman, and this is one of those rare opportunities when our work intersects, and I'm just very pleased about it. But it will be appearing in the fall, and it will be on Nova, and it is a 2-hour special on the origin of the Israelites and on the archaeology of the Bible and all the controversies, especially currently on the dating of the monarchic period, etc. But in it, and this was filmed this summer, I have a little preview of just a 3.5-minute clip of a sacrifice. And what I want to show you is something that has not been seen publicly yet. I think there's like one person in the room who's seen it. Sean Freight has seen it. I was showing it to him. And this was filmed in April. And I really don't know that much about the Samaritans, but if you know something, they are a group who still really do date their heritage and background to the Jerusalem temple. So here we have another type of lineage and appropriation and affiliation. And they still practice the Passover sacrifice every Passover at their time, where anywhere between, say, 46 or 48 sheep are brought, and there's a mass sacrifice. And so what you're going to see is that. And I will say a few things that I thought that would be helpful to be thinking of and looking at as we see this. First of all, and I'll talk a little bit about this afterwards, but there's systems of sacrifice. You're going to see the sheep brought. There are, actually, I think I have a couple of images here. There are trenches that are dug, and the sheep are lined up along the trenches, and you will see the high priest. He's in green. You will see him surrounded by a gendered cast of priests in white. You will see them chanting from the book of Exodus, because this is the Passover ritual. And you will see him give the signal as to sacrifice. And of course, sacrifice in the Jewish tradition, the Samaritan tradition, is, and probably Greek and Roman traditions as well, is the cutting of the jugular vein. Now, I will just say you don't actually see that. We edited that out a bit, but you'll kind of see them afterwards, what they do with the sheep. And that is, you will see a giant burning altar of sacrifice where certain parts of the sheep are put on that, specifically the fat, the kidneys, and intestines. And you'll see that burning and the smoke going to the heavens. And then you will see what the families do, which is they then place these sheep on these giant stakes into these burning oven pits, and they cover them for 4 hours, and then afterwards they all, with their families within the tradition, and they don't really give anything out to anybody else, they eat the Paschal sacrifice. So just thought I would show you that right now, and share that with you. Okay, yeah, good question. I actually had that on my notes. This is at the sacred site of the Samaritans, Mount Gerizim, and it's in the West Bank near Nablus. And this is taking place, you'll see at the beginning some ruins from this ancient temple site of the Samaritans. And the sacrifice takes place, I think, on a western hilltop right on Mount Gerizim. But it's in Israel. Okay. Okay. I'm just wondering why I don't see that play screen.
Did you hit play or not?
I haven't hit it yet. Do you think if I hit it, I'll see it?
Yeah, you should.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So I want to say some things about why I wanted to start with that film clip. And I think, first of all, I have to say, because you're here and not at one of those parties, I wanted you to get your money's worth. At least you saw a film clip no one's seen yet, and that will air on television in the fall. But there's another part of me that just wanted to sort of open it up to discussion now. It's just so rich in itself. But I also wanted to say a few things about it to start the discussion of some of the things that I want to talk about. First of all, and I'm, again, glad that students are here, in the course in the spring, we will be looking at sacrificial theories, especially anthropological theories, everything from feminist approaches by Nancy J. to the French schools of Detienne and Girard. So this is the kind of focus that will happen in that class. But primarily, I think that this clip is a good illustration about systems, and that systems need to be in place and in full play for sacrifice to work. We often think of sacrifice as somehow a split second over an altar in some way. But this type of sacrifice involves an entire industry and economy to support it, a long temporal and financial commitment to raising, selecting, transporting, and inspecting the livestock, space that allows for crowd control and spectatorship as well. You probably saw some of the stands in the back with spectators. And of course, the preparation of the animal carcasses by a gendered cast of priests who are very highly trained butchers, if you will, who know how to carve up very quickly an animal in a short time, offering exactly the right pieces on the altar for the divine. And although the modern day Samaritan sacrifice has a number of differences from practices within the ancient Jerusalem temple, all of these things that I've mentioned would have been true for that space as well. So I'd like to now turn to the Jerusalem temple. I only want to say a few words about it to begin the discussion. Some of you who know some of my other work know that I'm very interested in the archaeological and literary maps that we have to this temple. It's the model that we're looking at here is the second temple built by Herod the Great in 19 BCE and destroyed by the Romans in 70. If you're looking for a very in-depth walkthrough of this, I think the Religion 106 in the spring, which is for staff and the community, I will be doing a walk through the temple through each and every room and ritual in a more detailed way. But for today's purposes, I'd like to just point out a few features on this model of the Herodian structure. And also we should keep in mind that there are other imaginative and literal precursors to the Herodian structure, including the prophetic temple of Ezekiel, the tabernacle of Mosaic tradition, the temples of Solomon and Zerubbabel, and the idealized temple of the Temple Scroll. And these are all variously evoked in the late antique evidence under question. This first century temple, of course, is the one that Jesus knew. And it consisted of a highly structured and delineated space made up of spatial dividers, inscriptions detailing who goes where, gendered courtyards and that separated women from men, and architectural structures that divided priests from layfolk and divided Jews from non-Jews. And very specifically, we can look at, let's see We can see the inner courtyard here, and we can see one of the major devices that has gotten quite a bit of attention, the soreg, and we have an inscription from the soreg here, and we know that they existed both in Greek and Latin, Josephus tells us, and it encompassed and surrounded this entire interior space. And the soreg is one of those devices, really, that operated at both the discursive and non-discursive levels. It had an inscription as a spatial boundary marker, and it also was physically a spatial boundary marker. As we move to the inner courtyards, then, I just want to show you this map. And again, in just a very telegraphic, abbreviated tour here, to note that the primary place of ritual activity, of course, is this centralized area, the court of the priest, and this giant altar where ritual activity took place. There were a variety of other courtyards that kind of radiated from it and led to it. The court of the women, again, a space where both men and women could participate, but beyond which women were not allowed to proceed. And then the court of Israel, or the Israelites, into the court of the priests, and then the inner sanctum here, the Holy of Holies. I've tried to argue elsewhere that the treatment of blood here is particularly of interest because one of the things we know is that the most sacred substance in this structure is blood on the altar. It is the substance that is taken into the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement by the high priest. And at the same time, when we look at biblical prohibitions against other substances in this area as well, we see that blood also gets a lot of attention, especially blood from women's reproductive systems. And so there may, in fact, be some sort of antipathy or rivalry, if you will, between types of blood. This is simply to point to the fact that spaces, people, substances all play very significant roles in this particular place. So now I'd like to say something a bit about the notion of mapping. And I'd like to share just a few kind of questions I'm actually working with about the function and action of this so-called mapping. In 1931, the Polish-born mathematician Alfred Gorzybski made the statement, he said, "The map is not the territory." And he actually became the founder of the discipline of general semantics, and this phrase was key for him and his followers. And in it, it expressed a fundamental premise of general semantics, and that is that the word is not the thing it defines, the symbol is not the thing it symbolizes, and the map is not the territory it stands for. An abstraction derives from something or is a reaction to it, but the abstraction is not the thing itself. And he illustrates this with a number of different examples. One of them is, for example, if a stone falls on your foot, the pain that you feel is not the stone. It is your reaction to the stone, but it tells you really nothing about the stone itself. So this hermeneutical understanding not only influenced the Belgian surrealist René Magritte, who illustrated this concept about perception always interceding between reality and ourselves in his caption, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," but also you can go right now to a website devoted to general semantics and Gorzybski, and it's called thisisnotthat.com. So that's the basic premise here. Now, for the history of religions, probably most of you in this audience know that Jonathan Z. Smith quotes Gorzybski's remark in his very groundbreaking fundamental work at 1978, Map is Not Territory. And he fully integrates this notion into the study of ancient cultures. And Smith acknowledges the limits of the historian of religions, stating, map is not the territory, but maps are all we possess. The following year, after he published that, Jacob Neusner published his article, Map Without Territory, Mishnah's System of Sacrifice and Sanctuary, in the journal The History of Religions. And he really says this is an homage to Smith and his work. And specifically, though, what Neusner talks about there is that after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, there is no longer a territory. There is no longer a temple. And the Mishnah is almost entirely dedicated to being a map to the absence of that territory. And so all of the ritual practices and what the priests do to very fine details are delineated in this document, and it's a map to a non-existent territory. So these questions, I think, and again, this is as a work in progress, are things that I'm sort of working with right now as I look to this notion of then mapping that territory of the temple, which is non-existent in late antiquity, onto early churches and synagogues, or early Christian and Jewish spaces and people. And I'm also interested in how creative mapping and overlapping of maps come about, as well as the disjuncture between maps and territory. So I'll say something about that in a moment. Turning to Christianity and maps then. Much has been said about the typological strategies developed within Christianity to appropriate, reinterpret, and reconstitute theological prototypes from ancient Judaism. David the king prefigures Christ the king. Solomon the judge anticipates Christ the judge. Mary serves as an antidote for some authors to Eve. And the whale that swallows Jonah and spits him up 3 days later predicts Christ's tomb, spewing him up for resurrection. Typological readings, though, take on a particular poignancy when they draw from sacrificial imagery. Isaac, the sacrificial son, gives way to Christ, the sacrificial son. And the high priest who enters the Holy of Holies with animal blood heralds Christ, the high priest, who offers his very own blood. And I'll probably return to this, but I just wanted to sort of set the stage for early Christianity. This is actually just a mock-up of a church in the recent exhibition that's been traveling the United States called Cradle of Christianity, of what a typical early Christian church would look like, that I will say is post-4th century. So we need to keep that in mind, because some of the texts I'm going to talk about are earlier than that. But I would like to talk about actually this actual structure, which is the 6th century chapel of Theotokos on Mount Nebo in Jordan. And it really displays a very telling mosaic panel on the floor, strategically positioned behind the chancel barrier in front of the altar. So here what we have is the legs left of the altar here. You can see where the chancel screen troughs also would have separated this space from the rest of the nave in front of it. There's an aisleway in the middle. And then we can see this mosaic here, a bit better here, and the central feature of it as well here. The mosaic reveals the outline of an architectural complex approached by bulls and gazelles. S.J. Saller interprets the building as the Jerusalem temple, with an unmistakable fire burning in the altar area and with an inner edifice representing the Holy of Holies. A Greek text taken from Psalm 51 serves as a header for the entire composition and describes a sacrificial setting. And it says, "Then they shall lay calves upon your altar." Saller also traces these words to a 4th century Greek liturgical text of Jerusalem. And what we see here then is the mosaic mapping out and linking the priestly courtyard and the Holy of Holies from the Jewish temple onto this altar space within Christianity. Moreover, the strategic positioning of the mosaic between the chancel screens and truly underfoot as one enters the apse may well signal both an iconographical and theological platform upon which the priest would actually stand and deliver up the Christian sacrifice. So this kind of iconographical mapping we also see in a number of other mosaics and church structures. So I'd like to now turn to the early Christian texts that I'd like to address this evening. Texts from the 2nd to the 4th centuries show varying degrees of association between women and sacrificial objects. One of the first texts that links sacrifice and women is Polycarp's epistle to the Philippians. He writes, "Our widows must be sober-minded, making intercession without ceasing for all men, abstaining from every evil thing, knowing that they are God's altar and that all sacrifices are carefully inspected." Here Polycarp echoes 1 Timothy's description of widows who offer supplications night and day by framing contemporary widows as intermediary agents between God and people, as sacrificial tables, and as offerings carefully examined for blemishes. Female bodies become symbolic reference to elements beyond themselves. In the 3rd century, Tertullian continues this tradition by comparing widows to the purity of sacrificial altars when he discourages widows from second marriages, stating that it behooves God's altar to be set forth pure. Similarly, in the Didascalia Apostolorum, it urges that widows shall be reckoned by you in the likeness of the altar, and widows are the holy altar of God, of Jesus Christ. In the process of telling widows not to go from house to house, the text continues, "Let a widow know she is the altar of God. The altar of God does not go wandering about everywhere, but it is fixed in a single place." The apostolic constitutions depict widows and virgins as typological fulfillments of the Levites, but specify that widows represent types of the bronze altar that existed for burnt sacrifices in the tabernacle, while virgins represent types of the golden altar for incense. Furthermore, the text expands the inventory of sacrificial accoutrements, stating, "Consider the virgins as a type of censer and the incense," thus portraying virgins as both material vessel that accommodates the incense offering and the offering itself. Let's see. One more from Pseudo-Ignatius, but I actually forgot to put that one in my thing. Moving to the last one now. My last example, Methodius of Olympus, died in 311, gives us one of the most explicit typological descriptions of widows and virgins in relation to the altars of the Jewish tabernacle. He writes, "Since the tabernacle was a symbol of the church, it is fitting that the altar should signify some of the things in the church. The brazen altar to the company and circuit of widows, for they are a living altar of God. But the golden altar within the Holy of Holies, before the presence of the testimony, on which it is forbidden to offer sacrifice and libation, has reference to those in a state of virginity, as those who have their bodies preserved pure, like unalloyed gold, from carnal intercourse. Therefore also it stands near to God within the Holy of Holies, and before the veil with undefiled hands, like incense, offering up prayers to the Lord acceptable as sweet savor." Here Methodius casts virginal bodies as pure, unmitigated metal used to fashion the golden altar in the Jewish tabernacle. Moreover, they are spatially located within the most sacred architectural chamber, the Holy of Holies, which also happens to wear a veil. And this actually is a case of disjuncture and mismapping, because the golden altar was in fact outside the Holy of Holies, but Methodius actually then places it inside. In these texts, the patristic authors attempt to co-opt the sacrality associated with the sacrificial tradition of the Jews by mapping one Jewish reality onto a matching Christian one. In this effort to make a bid for the lineage of the tabernacle tradition, two incongruent maps result: sacrificial spaces and objects on the one hand, superimposed upon women on the other. Now, I have been working on some of these passages. Last year I actually just published one essay on this, and this year I'm really wanting to now in my book flesh this out much more thoroughly in a chapter, relating these strategies and the scholarship on them, which has mainly been working on the notion of the rhetoric within these passages, specifically to who control the altars. The bishops control the altars. So if women are then figured as altars, they come under a certain control as well, and are stationary and less wild in some ways. So I'd like to build upon some of that scholarship, but now put it into conversation with this larger typological movement that is afoot here in the patristic literature about specifically not just altars, but Jewish altars within the tabernacle. And I'm going to just kind of leave that as a question because I want to present the other piece of evidence. So I've presented one set of textual evidence, and this one then is the this thing kind of jumps around. This is the mosaic at Sepphoris, and actually, as I said, this is really brand new work for me. So I'm going to just step out here a little bit. Can I do that? And I'm away from this. Is that okay? This way I can look at it and point at it a little bit better. So in 1993, in Sepphoris, which is in the Galilee in Israel, a national park was being constructed and a parking lot was being built when the bulldozer, and you can see where the bulldozer actually came into this structure, making that parking lot, and found mosaic tesserae. And, of course, they stopped the parking lot, and beneath it they found an ancient synagogue and the mosaics from this floor. So, again, as I said, this has now been published by the excavator, and I want to share with you some of the intriguing things about this mosaic and why I think it's very important, and it really, I think, has to be incorporated into this conversation. First of all, here's a reconstruction of the exterior of it. It's a very long mosaic. It's a very long basilical structure. Here is a reconstruction of what it may have looked like on the inside. And you will notice then these very ornate mosaics going down the center aisle. And then there is a side aisle, and we'll even look at one of the inscriptions from that side aisle. As one would have entered from this area here, the excavators think there was probably a door on the side here. One would have then seen a series of mosaics. These are pretty badly damaged. I just want to mention what they are and then get to the ones that I think are more important up towards the front here. As one enters, one would have seen the story of Isaac and Abraham and Sarah in the bottom two panels. One would have then seen the zodiac with a sun disk in the middle, sort of replacing Helios. These are common in ancient synagogue mosaics. I'll show you a couple in a moment. We're going to talk about then the next two panels here, and then at the top we see another sort of, this is kind of stock iconography, minaret flanking a structure in the middle, probably a Torah shrine, but I'll offer some different interpretations of that as well. And at the top, these lions flanking a wreath. Other synagogues that are now very well known and from the same area and approximately the same time period also contain many of these iconographical motifs. Beit Alpha has the sacrifice of Isaac here, the zodiac, and then the minaret, the lions, flanking a structure. Hamat Tiberius as well, the zodiac, and this. But notice, neither of these and no other synagogue has these two panels in exactly this formation. And these two have sort of been inserted into what otherwise is commonly what commonly appears in this time period. And I want to look at those two, and they're sacrificial panels. So as we look at the top one, we see, and the excavator, Sepp Weiss, feels and says we should be reading it from right to left. So let's do that. There is a water basin here with these bull's heads that actually spew out the water into these bowls. The center object is a giant four-horned altar, and standing beside it, and we only get a little bit of the outline from the mosaic because the most part of this has deteriorated through some sort of natural cause. There are cisterns below, and the excavators don't know exactly what happened to the synagogue, but it doesn't seem to be vandalism. But we have this figure identified with Aharon. It's Aaron, the high priest, standing at the altar site. And beside him, or behind him, I would say, we also have a sense of animals also labeled for us here. There's a bull, and then standing behind the bull is a sheep, and it says, Et hakaves echad. This is the first sacrifice. So Weiss tells us we read from right to left, and then we go to the next panel below. And below it, we have more sacrificial objects here. And I show you the black and white photos because sometimes you can see a little bit better than the color. And below, we have then Etakaves Hasheni. Here is the second sacrifice of the day. We have the actual accoutrements of sacrifice, shemen, oil, solet, flour, depicted along with trumpets, the showbread table, a basket of sacrifice with the birds hanging down below. So we have a very huge amount of effort spent on trying to give us a sort of one-on-one mapping of what exactly these objects are, and that they are part of the daily sacrifice that happens in the temple in Jerusalem. I will also return to some of these other inscriptions, but I just want to say that three types of inscriptions exist here: Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. And the Hebrew often, as we just saw, will quote from the biblical text, in this case possibly Exodus 29, about the consecration of the temple and the consecration of the priesthood, in fact, and that's important. And the Greek text inscriptions are all dedicatory inscriptions telling us about who has donated to these panels. So I will say something about that in a moment. Okay. Now, here then are those two panels taken together. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just raise a number of questions that are right now, I think, on the plates of a number of scholars, and I would like to add to them some other questions. First of all, again, the sort of elephant in the room of this is that the synagogue after 70 is not a sacrificial space. And as a matter of fact, most scholars in this area will talk about how it is in some ways purposefully not like the temple. And so here we have non-sacrificial ritual and liturgy in the face of, or being ornamented by, sacrificial iconography. So that's one of the questions, is what is the relationship then between the rituals that are going on in this sacrificial imagery? We do have in one other synagogue, and you probably recognize Dura Europos from earlier, the 3rd century, one other panel that is right here. Here's the Torah shrine that also depicts sacrifice and Aaron. He's labeled here. The priesthood, sacrifice of the red heifer, the altar with the menorah, and an altar out front. So this really seems to be the only other panel. This is a fresco in a completely different area. and again, also in a non-sacrificial space. So one of the questions is this what someone would maybe just call biblical memory? Are we simply memorializing the temple? Are we simply remembering the heritage of the temple? Or is there something else going on? Now, one of the questions right now is the role of the priesthood. And you may have wondered when the temple was destroyed in the year 70, what happened to the priests? And there are a number of theories right now about that, and it's highly controversial. But we have, for example, this particular dedicatory inscription is from a priest. So remembered be for good Judah, son of Isaac, the priest, and Perigri, his daughter. Amen, amen. And so we actually have a woman as the daughter of this priest being noticed here as well. And she is the only female who is named or mentioned in the Mosaic inscriptions. So one of the other things that I think needs to happen with this mosaic is these inscriptions need to be put into conversation with the important work of people like Bernadette Bruton, who has worked specifically on inscriptions and women leaders in ancient synagogues, and to decipher in some ways the gender relations going on, but added to that this notion of possibly the priesthood still existent and still possibly exerting a certain amount of control and force on what we know as rabbinic Judaism. There are a number of people right now who are arguing very strongly for an increase in the priesthood at this time, specifically in relation to Julian the Apostate's rebuilding of the Third Temple, and at this time we see an increase in some of the Targumim, or literature, that seemed to be associated with the priesthood. So was that in some ways a hope for that, and did the priests in some ways then gain some more control and power? So I'm just saying that these are certain questions that are being hotly debated, actually, and I think it's very relevant, especially for notions of sacrificial, Aaron the high priest, front and center, sacrificial iconography in a non-sacrificial space. Okay. I also know, just let me take a look. I know at 6:30 is the film across the street, and so I know that we were being sandwiched between other things. So what I'd like to do is really just end there in some ways to say that those are the two pieces of evidence that I'm going to be working with this year. But again, around this question of how does that sacrificial imagery get mapped onto these spaces and people. I also want to say that this still exists today in a very strong way. And at CSWR here in the spring, one of the religion cafes I'll be presenting is, let me just move to that. Go past my thing here, is the recreation of first century Jerusalem in an Orlando theme park. And it is a very crazy place to be. And so you want to talk about a sacrificial map happening there. Here we literally have this sort of mapping out of this huge reconstruction of the Herodian temple, the Qumran caves, the Garden Tomb, and you can go into one of their big shows, which is the Wilderness Tabernacle Show. And here is the temple reconstructed. You can stand there and take pictures or whatever. Qumran Cave. And you can see in one day the two types of sacrifice taking place in the tabernacle, in the wilderness show, and at the end of the day, every day, the ultimate sacrifice. And this is an evangelical theme part. And so when we talk about the mapping and the appropriation of that Jewish sacrificial system, it's the primary intention that occurs here. And so that will be something in March. So with that, I'm just going to end and open it up.
when you showed us the clip from the Samaritan sacrifice, you had mentioned that there were a lot of those elements were also there earlier, and when you were showing us the map of the temple in Herod's time, I noticed the section where the sacrifice would take place, and I was wondering if there were spectators in that area, how people were, was that a component that was also there?
Yeah. That's a very good question because one of the things that is of interest is the visual accessibility of sacrifice, because evidently in some parts of the temple you could see what was going on, and in the temple courtyards around there were upper galleries, so that even Roman soldiers, people who were outside the soreg, people who were not even included within Judaism, could have visual access to generally what was going on. However, one of the problems is if you were actually inside in the court of the women, the Nicanor gate is the only visual access you could have had, and it's not clear how much sacrifice would have been visually accessible. So that's a very good question. The only text that talks about that very explicitly is the letter of Aristeas, who he talks about standing in that courtyard and looking through and seeing sacrifice, as well as seeing the doors into the inner sanctums, and talking about it as being very, very impressive. So really, it's hard to reconstruct.
I came across a Tefillah, a Yiddish woman's prayer for Yom Kippur, and in part of the liturgy, it was from maybe the mid-1800s, she describes among all of the offerings that she would give, she says, if I were in the high temple, I would take out my uterus and put my blood up on the altar. And it's just one of a very long list. And this is a genre that doesn't quite have Hebrew parallel, but I wondered whether in women's writing you've never seen, in religious Jewish women's writing, you ever saw that image come up. Because it's both defiling and shocking in the sense of the reach of the women's space into the altar, but also very emotional as a gesture.
Right. There are other people who work on women's literature sitting in this room who work on more current and modern Hebrew poetry and such, who might know that. There are some medieval parallels that are to the opposite effect. There are some medieval chronicles of, for example, when the Muslims came into Jerusalem, and there's a 13th century text that it's later, but it talks about how when they came in, what were the Christian women doing? They were taking their menstrual blood and on the cloths, and they were putting them precisely where the ancient temple in Jerusalem used to be, as if it's even to defile it more. And so, of course, then the Muslims come and they save that sacred site. So there are some interesting texts that will associate it in that way. The other thing that I would just say is, and I'm not sure about some other texts in neighboring countries at this time, but there are some scholars working on the layout of the temple itself and the Holy of Holies as a womb, as a female sort of anatomy, and finding some parallels in Mesopotamia for that. I don't know of any Hebrew texts or any ancient Talmudic texts or anything modern that explicitly does that. But that's very interesting.
Yeah, it seems to be a unique.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I did promise that I would end by 6:30 for the film series. So actually, I'm going to just switch hats to say that the next lecture WSRP is having is in the spring semester on February 7th, where Michelle Molina will be speaking to us. And also that one is in the Braun Room across the street on the Jesuit consolation culture in a globalizing world. So I want to invite everybody to come and hear Michelle's work on that. Okay. Thank you.